welcome to everyone, and welcome to not a formal conversation series with AADHum, but it is our version for this semester because we are very fortunate to have some folks on campus that we couldn't let be here without gracing us with a panel on some topics that I think are really interesting and poignant for these times that we're living in regarding technology, education, and community, and how these things get linked together, hopefully by the work of Black Digital Scholarship. So the title of today's panel is Transformational Intersections, Digital and Public Humanities, Using Humanities to Get Kids Involved with Tech. And so we're very fortunate to be joined by three esteemed panelists today. I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to get right into what I hope is a really productive and generative conversation for the folks that are here with us, and for the folks that will be watching this later on AADHum's website. So I'll start out by introducing our panel. First, all the way on my left, we have Reverend Dr. Joseph Brown, who is a native of East St. Louis. The Reverend Joseph Brown received his PhD in American Studies from Yale in 1984. His research background includes African American and American literature and aesthetics, African American religious history, and Black theology. He is the chair of the 1917 Centennial Commission and Cultural Initiative, and a scholar of East St. Louis history and culture. Dr. Howard Rambsy, who is a professor of literature at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, where he teaches courses on American and African American literature. He is the author of the Black Arts Enterprise. His articles, blog entries, mixed media exhibits focus on African American artistic production. And he coordinates the East St. Louis Digital Humanities Club, which is an arts and technology program for undergraduates, high school students, and middle school students. Is that right?
Yeah, now it's just moved to high school.
Moved to high school. Mm-hmm. And then finally we have Kevin Winstead. Kevin Winstead is an alum of the Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. He's a doctoral candidate in American Studies here at the University of Maryland. And his work focuses on the continuity processes of Black social movements. His current project is Emancipatory Hope, Reclaiming Black Social Movement Continuity, and it focuses on how Black activist communities pass along resistive knowledge temporally and spatially. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start out with asking all of you to kind of speak to us a little bit about your experience as broadly as you can with the community of East St. Louis. Provide us a window, if you will, into this space that we're going to dive into a little bit more deeply today. So maybe Dr. Rambsy or Father Brown, we could start with you.
I guess we're starting with me.
That's it.
East St. Louis was one of the largest industrial areas of the Midwest at the turn of the 20th century, but it was designed always to be protective of white privilege from the very beginning. In one of the great migrations that we have experienced of African descended people moving around, trains would go down into the South and bring Black people up to work in the packing houses, on the railroads, and the other industries like the aluminum ore plant and the glass factory. When they came into East St. Louis, they became a very powerful force in local politics, and they were drivers of the economy, which meant, of course, that they were under great suspicion, attack, and hatred. It culminated in two different riots, race riots meaning white instigated domestic terrorism, in the spring and summer of 1917, one in May, one in July. The May one, some people in a cynical way would call that a warm-up. But the awful experience which helped to transform American history was in July of 1917, when people were convinced that Black terrorists had killed police officers. That wasn't true, but we don't usually have to have a true reason for instituting racism and terrorism. So the mobs, male and female, went through the Black community, killing whatever they could find, not whoever, just whatever. They burned down houses, women who had babies in their arms were rushing out of the houses. They picked the babies up, threw them back into the houses. They killed the women. Some of the white women who were, a number of them who were, I don't know how we would call it today. Well, they were prostitutes. That's how we would call it today. Working in the red light district, which was completely supportive of and supported by the local police and political establishments. They were taking over the streetcar sites and pulling people off the streetcars and beating them to death in front of the police and the state militia. There is no accurate way of knowing how many people were murdered during that time, but my rather educated suspicion is at least 400 people, because they've never discovered all the mass graves, and they didn't count the people who were thrown into the rivers and creeks, nor did they count the people who moved across the river into places like Kinloch and Ferguson and other places, and who died days later. So the newspaper accounts are never accurate when it comes to counting black bodies.
Yeah.
But the reason it was transformative is because the Urban League organized itself around the dispossessed. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, two of the founders. First of all, Ida B. Wells came down and made an incredible act, which we could call the prototype of technology and media, by what she did as an on-the-field sociologist. And I maintain that she was the first real great sociologist predating Du Bois, because she was his mentor. And we know how he turned against her. But the NAACP came in and did an awful lot of work. The United States Army did an investigation, and so did the United States Congress. No one was ever prosecuted for anything, and that disposition turned the city around.
Yeah.
But since then, the city was organized in a way that most of the tax base from all of the industries were incorporated outside the city of East St. Louis. So when we talk about community development and justice, the packing houses were National City, and the aluminum ore was Allerton, and they just made sure that the tax base never went into the city to keep it going. That's kind of my father's parents lived in East St. Louis during the time of the riot, and my mother was taught by people in school who had been some of the great witnesses, like Daisy Westbrook. So I had a history of knowing about it, and knew that the elders and the ancestors were telling me to talk about it.
I think this is such an important place for our conversation to start, because, I mean, some of us, I'm from Illinois, I know some of us are from Illinois and know a bit about this, but I don't think that it's a widely understood moment, as it should be, in social movement history, right? In the way that we start to contextualize our present iterations of social movements in that area, and how we really have to think back to the past in order to understand the context of what you're talking about. So I wonder, Dr. Rambsy, if you could talk to us a little bit about, as you begin to approach this moment in East St. Louis and this space now, how does the past inform what you're looking at now in terms of how students are being educated, how communities are dealing with the ramifications of a past that we haven't fully explored?
Yeah, I think a lot of it deals with, at least for me, a past in like education. And so in some ways, and we were talking about this yesterday, like sometimes cities have so many things that replicate or look similar no matter where you are. So I think if you're in Chicago, people talk about the struggles of the public schools. And that's one of the things. I deal a lot with young people, high school students in particular, in East St. Louis. So I started in 2003 working at SIUE, but when I moved there, I moved to St. Louis. And I wasn't even familiar fully with the idea that, East St. Louis, and I thought I was going to be driving around St. Louis and come, So it's later I learned you cross this bridge and you're in East St. Louis. But fortunately, my university had a relationship and actually has different services that they offer in East St. Louis. And so that was how my kind of entry into working there. I thought I'd be doing things in St. Louis, but it was because of the university connection. So I did a tour of a school when I was there, and there was a retired teacher who had come back to teach, and when I was all of the incoming professors are going through, she stopped me and she said, hey, I want you to come back and do work in the school. And so she was a master teacher in so many ways. So actually the first several months there, I didn't do any volunteer service. I just sat in the classroom when she was teaching English. And it benefited in that way. So it was much later. It was almost like student teaching, but just really, no, it wasn't even student teaching. It was just being a student. And so I did that. And then later I started figuring out what people were interested in and what I could offer from my position as a professor. But getting to the question about that, like that past, to me just it seems like there are a lot of struggles in terms around income inequality and just like folks just not having a lot of resources. And that's because sometimes people are just free to go other places. Like, you know, people who could be teachers there are professors somewhere, or they're at, we always talk about that, it's like so few African American teachers, so like these ones who come out of school, undergrad, they're really good, they get bought up by large white districts or wealthy white districts. And I guess that's over everything, right? Police forces get done the same way. In St. Louis, there are these surrounding counties that have a little bit more money, so they buy up all the, anyway, so I think to me it's like that, it's like these large systems going on. The plus is though, it's like a lot of energy there. And folks all seem to be glad when I show up, and I'm glad to be there. And so we get to do a lot of different projects that aren't always offered in other places. So
I want to talk a lot more about the work that you're doing with students, but I wondered if we could, if I could bring Kevin in on this question. I think something you said is so important about the notion of being a student first before trying to get involved and teach the kids and be a mentor or create a program. And I'm always struck by your work, Kevin, in terms of being a student of social movement history before beginning to make suggestions about the current state of social movements.
Sure.
Could you talk to us a little bit about what it means to be a student of social movements in relationship to now understanding the present moment in terms of organizing in the East St. Louis area?
Sure. So, full disclosure, I did my undergrad in Carbondale, which Illinois' kind of spatial history is really interesting. So as far as I'm concerned, Carbondale is a suburb of Chicago, even though it's 5.5 hours away. Most of the African American population come from Chicago, and if not from Chicago, then definitely St. Louis, or the greater St. Louis area. What I found to be really interesting in my undergraduate experience there was the relationship Carbondale had to the history of the Black Panthers in Chicago and to the history of activism in the Midwest, that there was no way for me to know that as a high school student. So my interest in social movements come from a personal place. My father has ties to activism in his youth. But the questions, my initial questions around movement work were very local. So being around alums and some of the people we would bring in as guests, and also just understanding the local histories. Our Black Studies program in Carbondale very much focused on local history. My questions weren't so much framed as, you know, big scholarly activism as much as it was trying to understand my local surrounding, the local politics and history. Why is it that Carbondale is a suburb of Chicago, and yet the closest major Black population was East St. Louis, right? Never made sense to me. So just starting and asking those questions, and then from there, some significant points in history happened for me. So while in my undergrad, Hurricane Katrina happened. To have this major influx migration of Black people in the New Orleans area, students in the New Orleans area come, and to see my institution have to now break almost every rule and policy and norm to be accommodating, right? So, you know, we're having admissions in the middle of the semester. These people don't have any way of proving anything about housing. And in a lot of ways, they did a lot of great work in just doing what was necessary. But then now asking the question, well, if you can do that, then how come so many of my, there was always this stat that comes up that 1 out of every 4 African American men in Carbondale are going to not make it to sophomore year of college. And it's like, well, you've proven that you can make the leaps when you want to, so why then does this keep occurring? And the second major point, so I came to the University of Maryland in 2011, but I always in the summer go back to Carbondale to work because there's not much to do in the area, which is great for my studying. But I was in Carbondale when Ferguson happened and Mike Brown's death happened, and then also have a social network where I'm getting text messages saying, hey, something's weird, and everyone is flocking to the area to kind of see what's going on, not knowing that it's going to be that. It's just, it's weird.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, that I think starts my journey in my doctoral program in social movements. It was like, what is this? And then to see the similarities between Ferguson and East St. Louis in the way that land is annexed, and you can be in the car driving for 5 minutes and pass through 3 different towns that have 3 different police departments that you can get taxed 3 different ways, and all of a sudden we're having debtors prisons that are based on the geospace and what that kind of pressure puts on people and how they respond to it, and all of a sudden in these macro ways we're seeing something that we're now calling a social movement. I don't think it's an accident that kind of the origin story of NAACP is in East St. Louis and kind of the origin story of Black Lives Matter is in Ferguson. Right? I don't think that's an accident at all. So yeah, a lot of my journey is just trying to explain my local, and that led me to things like DH, because that's where my people were.
Well, I think that each one of you has touched in some way on this notion of what I would think of as like a collective memory in this area, right? Where there is a shared memory that is in some ways missing pieces, but in some ways very real for folks who live there, of what has happened and what that means for the present. Father Brown, you said something about no one being prosecuted from that 1917 terrorist action. And I wonder about that kind of a collective memory, that something as grave as this can happen in this place, and no one can be held accountable, and how we see that replicated, and what that means for folks who are living there now, as Kevin said, and experiencing kind of this over and over again as murders of Black men and Black women happen in this space.
I heard a couple things, and I think that we should have another panel discussion so that I can do the backstory on all the things Kevin Winstead didn't say about being a student of social movement theory. And when we have a break or something, I will deal with that, because I thought that was one of the most interesting narratives I'd ever heard composed on the spot. But my colleague here from Edwardsville, I would want to know, who was the retired teacher?
Oh, Sandy Essen.
Okay. Southern Illinois University, he said, has a common, and Kevin said it, has a common obligation to East St. Louis, much more than a common obligation. The site of the bloodiest destruction of human lives is the land where the East St. Louis campus of Southern Illinois University is today. That was the near south end, nearest the riverfront and the downtown area, and more people were murdered on that land. One of the members of our 1917 commission, when we did a kind of a visual, a walking map of the sacred sites, and one of the very early documentaries that was done about the race riot, she broke into tears because she did not realize that where she grew up was on that land. So we're talking about memory. What he said about the retired teacher said, come and sit here and learn. My next question would be, how do we understand that East St. Louis, because of the economic issues, that some of the richest people who are African American came out of East St. Louis? We have diplomats, business millionaires, educators, Donald McHenry, who had been the United Nations representative after Andrew Young. We have people, the producer of Black Panther, Reginald Hudlin, East St. Louis, his daddy and uncle ran an insurance company there, agency there that my family always used. Now, what I want to know is, when we start to have the digital projects of connecting cultures and connecting generations,
Yes.
the retired teacher took a very young professor and said, I want to teach you some things about adapting to this community.
That's right.
He takes middle school students and high school students and undergraduates and says, go into this community. My big issue would be, how do we train those people with whatever media opportunity you have to tap into the trauma?
Yes.
Because tapping into the trauma, a grandchild or a great-grandchild can get a very old person to tell a story. That's how I learned history. My grandmother's photograph collection that we set in her bedroom, and she told me all these people, and those pictures dated back to 1878. Now, how do you get those pictures digitized if you want them? But how do you get a 9-year-old to say, Uncle Joshua, what happened? And he will probably tell him because it's a front porch or the equivalent kitchen discussion. But the one place where I don't find the digital humanities focusing on the young in the Black community with the greatest effect. I want to know how you can bring something in there and force me to tell the truth about all sorts of things. And Mr. Winstead did one of the most amazing interviews I've ever witnessed. The only Black Catholic nun to march in Selma. She died last year, right around the time of, right around November.
Yeah.
Sister Antona Ebo. When he finished his master's thesis, he discovered her name and said, I wish I had known about her, I would have put her in my thesis. And my response was, well, you want to go visit? Write her a letter and she will respond. We went up there and she said to us in her retirement apartment, I don't feel like talking to you all today. I really wanted to just cancel all this. 2.5 hours later, I said, I gotta go home. But you had the very young with a woman who was already in her 80s and who had been an active participant in history, being recorded for the future.
Right.
That to me, how do you tap into and respect the trauma? Because so many Black people will say, as they did after slavery, I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about it. That's over with.
Right.
That was not what they meant.
Right.
What they meant was, if I bring the pain back up, how will you help me? Now, how do we do that in this digital media humanities? Respect where my trauma is, and I will tell you a story of how I survived.
I don't have a better question than that, so I think that's a fantastic for you all to jump in.
Yeah, okay. So I'll jump in as the person who did that interview. That was actually one of the most informative moments on how to conduct research, qualitative research in Black spaces. Because I found that it was actually what I wanted for my own academic purposes was the least important part of the entire process. That I actually find the work in a lot of ways disturbing, because I'm asking someone to hurt again for my needs, right? And and that's just a real part of the work that we do. But it was all the moments that in the transcriptions seemed to be irrelevant. The joking to, bring someone back to ease, or the fact that, as she was saying that, she was in her kitchen making tea for everyone, and it's not necessarily that I was thirsty, but I was going to have the tea because that's part of the ritual process of comfort.
That's how you get the elder to be open.
Yeah, and that moment is actually something that stayed with me, and I've wrestled with in a lot of the Black studies conversations that I've had since. which is there's always this kind of this false dichotomy that happens between like joy and trauma in Black Studies conversations, right? You know, and so in one extreme, I would hear things like, it's not really Black Studies if we're not talking about the pain, right? And on the other end of Black Studies, I've heard like, you know, my Black Studies is built, you know, in not regarding this particular type of trauma or pain, or in absence of, or is focused on joy in a particular way that doesn't always resonate as authentic for me. That it's always been a blend, right?
But Black girls are magic.
I'm not even going to touch that. Is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to ignore that. But for me, what's resonated true has always been a blend, right? Like, you know, joy in spite of, right? Or the times where, as an individual, I don't have access to it, so now I have to rely on community in particular ways. Yeah. So I think I also agree with you that I don't know that I've seen successfully, and it was why I was really very much interested in this particular panel, because I struggle making sense of East St. Louis in a very familiar way that I struggle making sense with Ferguson, right? So a lot of the work, or a lot of the research around movements happen in such urban centers, right? It would make more sense if we were talking about it as St. Louis, right? East St. Louis, for me, I have a hard time placing, is it an urban space or a rural space, right? The language I have around how to make sense East St. Louis doesn't fit that way, in the same way that Ferguson doesn't fit. And so for me, as someone who's studying this, who wants to study this for a living, in struggling with that, I can only imagine the middle school student trying to evaluate their own local importance, right? It doesn't fit any narrative that I'm, you know, spending my entire day with particular types of textbooks to get through. I can't imagine for the middle school student to be told the importance of their own local, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating you say that, because I really wish I could talk to people, or I need to talk to more people who work with high school students like I do around the country, and I want to see how, in Black spaces like I do, the number one thing you'll hear young people talk about as it relates to violence, though, now, like just this summer, someone will get killed in a Black space, and the thing you always hear them say is like, why can't this get the attention that Mike Brown got? Right. They always ask that now. Like, and it's just, it's so interesting to me, because I don't know what you put in that place before. But like, and what I'm saying when somebody gets killed, like it'll be often it'll be a young Black man will shoot another Black child, another Black man. And I remember this summer, they were just really upset. There was Cahokia is another smaller town near East St. Louis. So the kids in the program I work with were just so upset because this couldn't get the attention that Mike Brown got. And it just keeps happening like that. Like they just keep saying, so I'm just thinking it's so connected to media, it's connected to so-and-so. So people were just asking those questions like, why can't we get, you know, people, like you were saying, people were coming from Carbondale to, and they wanted to know, why wouldn't people come here for, you know, John? So anyway.
But in that though, there's a lot, and this I guess where the cultural studies person can definitely make an intervention, because in my work, it seems so obvious, and yet so many spaces I see people miss it. We don't actually march historically because of death, right? We don't protest because of death.
That's right.
We protest when you don't give us the ability to mourn death, right? So Ferguson doesn't become Ferguson because of Mike Brown's death, actually. The narrative has become that in popular spaces, right? That he died, people get upset. And that's not what happened. What happened was he died and they made a memorial. And then the police drove through the memorial. And now I'm upset because now you didn't allow that mother to mourn. So now I'm willing to risk, you know, bodily my material body to make an intervention.
But one of them would be the radio though, because I remember sitting at home on that day in St. Louis, and I don't know what. No, actually, somebody called me like, "Yo, dude, turn on the radio, like switch on the radio," and they were on the radio saying, "Hey, they shot this dude, and he's on the ground right now."
Right.
And like everybody was getting out there for that. They
Yeah.
were like, yo, he's still on the ground.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if you've seen like, so
Yeah.
now they much more, they got these little orange things
Yeah,
they
yeah,
put
yeah.
up around people. It's weird though, because it's really low,
Mhm.
but somehow if it's there, you can't see.
Mhm.
But that was the thing on that day. Like
Yeah, yeah.
everybody was hitting there, and I was
Yeah.
just thinking, then you start seeing the social media. But I was just so fascinated in retrospect.
Yeah.
That today when something happens, people tell me, hey, go check on Twitter.
Yo,
Go
yeah,
check
yeah,
out. But I like had this distinct memory of they saying, turn on the radio.
Yeah.
And you know, in St. Louis, radio is really interesting because you know,
Right,
black
yeah.
folks on there and we just talk.
Right.
You know, just like we talking. Well, not even like we talking now. I
Yeah.
mean, it be like going.
Yeah.
And so everybody was on radio, and that got people there.
Mhm.
And that was interesting. You mentioned the mom because I remember one of the reporters got her to early. This never happens.
Mhm.
She was at the scene,
Yeah.
and she was just talking,
Mhm.
like, and you know, later she, you know, her lawyer was like, "Hey, you shouldn't be into talking."
Right. Right.
And so she was more, you know, contained. But I loved hearing her at that moment because she went in, and that's why we talking about education. She started talking about he was just getting out of high school.
Yeah.
He was
He was
doing
on
this,
school.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I thought that was so fascinating. Like of all the things she would say, literally while the son is there on the ground, is to start talking about him in school.
Yeah.
So I thought that was just so fascinating. But no, they got moving because it was this boy, and you could literally see him laying on the ground. I think that image more than anything shaped people seeing it. But yeah, you're right. Later they got on it, but just seeing that body laying there was
But I think
moving.
what Kevin said is so impactful, right? Is that
Yes.
there is a history of black trauma and black death that black folks have dealt with in this country in a variety of ways. What sparks marching is the inability to mourn in the ways that express full humanity, right? The ability to say this was wrong, I am sad, and I grieve. And when that's taken away by injustice, it sparks this moment. So, Father Brown, please.
That was the same impactful moment
Yeah,
that he said that, and that was worth everything
yeah,
because it takes me back to
Yeah.
where I spend my time.
yeah.
You're not going to ever have the language that says, is it urban or rural?
Right.
We lived in East St. Louis, and both of my grandmothers had gardens. My maternal grandmother had her garden, and her husband had his because they couldn't agree on anything. But she used that to feed people.
Right.
But it was in the middle of the city,
That's right.
20th Street, not on a suburb. There wasn't such thing. So we carry our spaces and define them according to our need, which is the same way we define our performances. And if we're going to be dealing with digital humanities again, we're dealing with the performance of blackness. And we've always had our own strategy for dealing with trauma. It's called song. From the slave ships to Massey Hall with that incredible quintet of jazz musicians way back in the day, to whoever is performing badly mostly in tribute to Aretha Franklin, but I don't want to go there. The point is how I'm starting out, and I say sometimes I feel like a motherless child. That's not a metaphor. But by the time I get through singing it, somebody 2 fields over is connecting with me, and if that's not the prototype of digital media, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
I'm not going, and if they start singing back, I'm not as bad off as I was. I have performed myself out of the depth of the trauma into something more human, more complete. But I have to use my voice, and we have to use our bodies, as we were told yesterday in another presentation from this program. We have got to understand that the spirituals, the blues, and jazz are all the same performance need. I've got to go from here to somewhere else, and I'm going to be spirit possessed. If it's a riff, if it's an improvisation, if it's just, again, Aretha or Patti LaBelle or somebody going absolutely stone cold crazy, I'm going to have to get from where I started. And it's always in the valley of death.
I think each of you have talked about in your work and in the work that you do and the work you talked about today, these threads that weave together the Black experience in some ways. But I think what's fascinating about, if we can start to connect this to digital humanities as Father Brown has done, is the local, right, of the very deeply personal work that each of you has done and has spoken about today in terms of keeping memories alive within communities, of respecting communities, of understanding the nuances of spaces. That is really potentially something that's transformative for digital humanities and for Black digital humanities. I wonder, Dr. Rambsy, if you could talk a little bit about the Digital East St. Louis Project and about East St. Louis Digital Humanities Club and the importance of this local community and the impact it's been having on children.
Yeah, so it started as the STEM Center in my school was working with the Digital Humanities Center at my university, and they jointly applied for an NSF grant. And they gave them time to work on. They were going to work with local students, and particularly in East St. Louis, to just give them exposure to DH as one STEM field, or just digital or technology, give them exposure to one aspect of STEM, and hopefully start in middle school, and it would carry on and have people just exposed. Because a lot of the researchers said that, students get exposed early on, you know.
Right.
So when that grant started to end, I just proposed that, hey, we continue it on and we have a Digital Humanities Club with East St. Louis students. So that's what I've been running the last two years. And I've probably been doing all kind of digital projects forever, but now just giving it a name, you know. So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years on that. And it's worked really interesting in some ways, just exposing students to just projects with DH. So that can mean the smallest things, that's working with recorders, but most often it means us working with like sound editing and music editing, because the music part really gets folks. But it's interesting though, because generationally, you know, the kind of music folks are in, like is a certain kind of rap that folks into, and what I've been blending in, my background is in African American literature, so I bring in a lot of poetry. So we do a lot of mixes of poetry, remixing our own voices. And so it's been really interesting and fascinating to do that.
Yeah. If I just want to say, I think it's really important that you pointed out something that's an ongoing thing that I think about a lot, which is a lot of the money for working with Black folks is directed towards STEM education.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
This notion that STEM will save us in
Yeah,
some way, right?
yeah.
But I think what you've done so brilliantly here is expose this notion that the humanities and digital humanities has a really important role to play, not only in introducing kids to technology, but in making that connection back to community,
exactly,
right? And what then do the humanities bring? So maybe, Kevin, you could talk a little bit about your work with digital humanities and community, and talk about the difference between exposing kids to tech and exposing kids to DH and what that looks like.
Yeah, so this 2019 has been a weird year for me, being on the market. It's been much more informative than I was imagining. A lot of the job opportunities that resonated with me were at this kind of intersection of public humanities and DH work. And no matter what size of the institution, every institution says that they're underfunded, right? Especially as they're thinking about, building digital humanities programs. But at the same time, me entering the space, I can't do this work without it being somewhat focused on marginalized communities, and particularly local communities, and the justice in that space, right? Which then, interesting enough, and how a lot of this comes full circle, the work we've done with AADHum over the last 2 years has been race, place, and space focused, or on movements at different types of movements, social movements, movement of the body. We've kind of played with that for the year. And I think the major takeaway from that experience for me is that Black DH doesn't always look like the latest and best in technology. It looks a lot like using the tools that people have in their everyday
Yes.
to do critical work.
Yes.
So then my intervention in a lot of these spaces of employment has been, well, you already have things. Let's start with that, right?
Yeah.
Every kid comes in with a computer and a cell phone. What does DH look like if I only have a computer and a cell phone, right? Or what does, going in the field look like if only thing I have as a research tool is a cell phone, right? And to see the shift that, you know, the people are, me saying that to them and then see the shift they have around what the capacity for DH could be, and then for them to then link that capacity back to justice work, right? Which then brings me to your project. What I find to be so fascinating and really unique as a DH project is that it's one, we're talking about literacy in a space, but we're also giving the kids to do the work of remembering, because as a critique to the system purposely trying to forget them, right? Which I also think in a lot of ways the area is such can be looked at as a metaphor for what's about to become. I think about Chicago and the kind of the gentrification that's happening in Chicago, and they're pushing all of what used to be urban Chicago to the suburbs, right? But now it's going to have the same questions and look fuzzy in the same way that I now think about Ferguson and East St. Louis, right? What does it look like when it's South Holland that's having the trauma, and instead of it being called Chicago? And how do we remember that differently, because it's not Chicago that's having the trauma, it's South Holland or Hammond, or, you know what I mean? And it doesn't produce the same importance nationally because it's not the major city, right? So then what I suspect will happen is that we'll forget these communities and that trauma, and then the responsibility of remembering those communities and that trauma and what that means is going to fall back on its own citizens.
The slogan that one of our commissioners came up with for the 1917 Centennial Commission was East St. Louis, the city that survives. Now, I have a justice call. You just brought it up. You all are talking about a justice call. This is the old people talking now. They've come into this room and have taken over my body. You just have to let them all talk. I want those high school students and middle school students to be in charge of the homecoming of East St. Louis. I mentioned the millionaires, the doctors, the lawyers, the politicians, the entertainers. We had more musicians, more than Miles Davis. But that's the one everybody knows about East St. Louis. Down the block from my mama's house was his brother's house, and they turned that into a museum. You got the Catherine Dunham Museum. You got all these wonderful opportunities to see a cultural initiative where people would come to that city to see the history of survival and transcendence and resilience. But I want those people who left there, because you are so right. The major population demographic of East St. Louis are the very old and children. The biggest economic supports are the school district and welfare. Property values are laughable. If a house is worth $5,000, I'd be stunned in many of the neighborhoods of East St. Louis. And all of that has always been on purpose. But the young people can say, we need you, and we can get across the universe to tell you that. We want you, and we can use every media style we can come up with. If it's just a cell phone, I want my grandmother to tell somebody who ain't been here since he was in junior high school, come on home and do something. The whole notion of justice is when the superintendent of schools back in the 1960s, I think it was, had to flee to Africa because he was getting ready to be arrested for fraud. We've had at least a couple mayors go to jail. They turned over, as they have done when you talk about gentrification. The first thing was, we will turn your city over to people after we have completely looted it. Now you will have to deal with something that is impossible to deal with, and we will call you a failure without ever taking responsibility for it. But it has survived. The small businesses, the women's businesses, the men's businesses, those are all over town. And they are ways of organizing collectively. But I want to see we don't have, and this is a weakness, it was part of the mission of the 1917 Race Riot Commission, was to engage the curriculum of the school districts, and the system pushed us back. This is the project that would be the door opening, but it's not enough to tell them how to use it. They've got to learn how to make it work to bring some of the lost people back home. You want a reverse migration? That's what I think East St. Louis is ready for.
So this is, I think, really interesting because it recalls for me this moment of I mean, Kevin and I, we've had this conversation at AADHum of this idea that Black people need to be taught the digital in order to have whatever progress it might be, right? If the key is we go into the schools or we have these programs, and if we just teach Black folks how to use tech, then it'll be, you know. But I think what each of you has brought out is that there are these survival strategies that often predate the digital in Black communities that when met with digital humanities can have really emancipatory effects. So I think Father Brown has spoken to this. I wonder if you two could as well think about what are these survival strategies of the folks of East St. Louis, of Black folks more broadly, and what does that mean for those to meet with the tools of the digital humanities?
All right, yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think through. I will say that, so I used to do these exhibits, and every now and then still do mixed media exhibits, and I remember I was asking a couple of folks who worked in museums how to do them, and they were like, oh, you should go to museums, and the exhibits you really like, try to emulate those. And I think that's been the really strongest driver. I always have mixed feelings about the music editing, because, I mean, the students really love that, so much so it's hard to get them to do something else. But I think it's because they're like, oh, wow, I heard these songs on the radio, and now I'm learning how to create those. And so that survival, in some ways, emulation, and like, how do I recreate this thing? I think I'm going to just have to, one of the challenges and opportunities for me is just to push them to see other things they're really into in the world, this digital based, and like, how do we recreate that kind of thing?
And seeing what they already have as skill sets.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
That this is not a deficiency where I'm coming to train you, but you love music, you hear this intonality, you're able to piece this together. That is a skill. You've been told it's not, but it is.
Yeah.
And here's how we make that manifest.
And then, because the music, they feel very like, hey, I know more than you, Mr. Professor, on this music thing.
Yeah.
So I love that part. One of the things I would always do when I first was working just at the high school of East St. Louis, I would say, hey, I'm from St. Louis, and I would say, I love being from, living in St. Louis, because that's where they came up with the mono. It's a dance. Boy, like the student wouldn't be talking about anything else, but when I said that I'm from St. Louis, and St. Louis we created the mono, it would set them off, because all East St. Louis folks know that the mono started in East St. Louis. And I was like, no, it's a St. Louis. And they were like, no, because it was named after the monastery, which is very telling. The monastery was the name of the club, famous or infamous club, however you want to describe it. Anyway.
We can edit this out.
No, keep that one in.
But they were so invested in telling me the history of it, and so I think, you're right. Like, so they were very familiar with a certain kind of cultural,
storytelling
recent,
practices,
that was actually, so I think just trying to think through other things like that. I would say, like, too, almost a somewhat morbid subject, but I was if you're in St. Louis, not everyone, but I think about gun violence in St. Louis. But being interested in gun violence in DH, it actually led me to Baltimore. Because Baltimore, more than any other city, all the terror, they did a really good job of documenting it, though. So if you go on the Baltimore Sun, they have this interesting site that you can do just you can look, hey, do I want to look by male or female? Do I want to look by neighborhood? It's very... So I started watching that as I was trying to think, and I would always complain. I'd say, oh, wow, the newspapers in St. Louis need to document gun violence the way they do. And because I think that would, like I say, it's everyone. If you're in St. Louis, East St. Louis, the big critique is always, they don't follow this like Mike Brown. And it's interesting, I'm always thinking, hey, they also don't follow this like Baltimore does. And LA got, some years ago, this woman wrote a book called Ghetto Side. And her big project was she went around trying to interview everybody's family who had gotten killed in some kind of violence, and it was usually gun violence. And so they, so the LA Times started documenting it so as well. So those are the two places that document. But these are DH projects in some ways, and now Chicago does it. If you've probably seen. So these are very much DH projects. So it's interesting that like even the things that we think are like struggles, and I'm like, actually, you all could tell a lot of stories about
Yes.
even the biggest challenges in the city, and they will tell you that like a big challenge is gun violence. So it's interesting.
So, I'm really, really appreciative that to have you both here, both being, you know, leadership chair director of Black Studies programs who serve the same community. For me, I didn't know I was an academic until I was exposed to Black Studies, because it never made sense to me that I was being trained as if I didn't already know a thing, right? Particularly around tech, right? I'm being trained to do something that I was born with, in a lot of times, right? My survival instincts was, you know, I got a PlayStation for Christmas or a Nintendo for Christmas, and wasn't nobody in the house there to hook this thing up but me, so I had to figure it out, right? And went through all of that process. So, and then to see within Black Study spaces that same kind of duality of much of the work of Black Studies is reforming other spaces, but then also much of the work of Black Studies is cultivating and developing something that's very much like a intra-group thing. So sometimes Black Studies is very much an internal thing, and sometimes Black Studies is very much this external thing. And I see this play itself out in how we're thinking about DH, particularly around this project. A lot of the work of DH when we're selling it to grants is exposing people to tech. But a lot of the reform, or a lot of the change I've seen in DH in my short time with it has been around requiring or forcing DH to redefine itself, right? So new media, social media as being a DH project wasn't the case 4 or 5 years ago. 3 minutes ago, right? It is now. It is now, because the argument is, well, this is how Black people enter the space. So are you going to exclude communities because they don't have your preset definition? Or are you going to reform yourself because this is where actual people are? That, as a Black Studies project, seems very familiar to me. It's like, yeah, we can do it your way sometime, but you best believe you're going to do it our way too, right?
And even when they recognize social media though as DH, I don't think they say DH scholars, because like, yeah, if you could ask whomever the representative DH scholars are, like ask them to list 100 DH scholars, and you're gonna very rarely hear Black folks. It's only in some spaces that because you invited me to talk about DH, then I was likely to say I'm a DH scholar. But non-Black people almost never ask me to come speak about they don't view me as a DH person. So that's why I'm always ambivalent about the term. Just because, Black folks, in my view, are very excluded from it. Like with anything else, right? You get invited to the Black panel, which is fine, which is why I embrace it. But I've thought about that a lot, how the core of DH doesn't really accept like Black folk, like DH scholars who are Black. It's complicated, right? Because you're excluded but observed. Right? Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And we'll have another, I think Catherine talked about this yesterday that I find to be so familiar, which is you're excluded when it's coming time for recognition or resources, but the next wave of innovation is going to look exactly like your project, right? So then, in this weird, complicated way of like, am I or am I not a part of this space? And it's like, somehow I'm a part of this space always for a future conversation, right?
A scholar that we have in common is the late Father Walter Ong, who did a whole lot about secondary orality and literacy. But I didn't know, I never have had a field. I don't have a discipline, which I know my mother would have told you. But, no, she would have said I'm not disciplined. But I didn't know what cultural anthropology was when I took his class. This is in the 1960s. He'd bring in a reel-to-reel tape recorder, sit it on the desk, click, this is Walter J. Ong, this is March 13th, and the class topic today is such and such, and he'd just ramble on. And then when we raised our hand, he'd click it off. And then he would only put his answers on this tape. So I watched him do this kind of stuff in 1967.
Yeah, yeah.
But then when I got a hold of his article on the talking drum,
Yes.
I went, oh my God.
Right.
When did this man, all of a sudden, this is not Walter Ong, this is the Walter Ong, the friend of Marshall McLuhan, the person who actually put into strategies so much of the electronic village.
Yes.
But he said, as a matter of justice, people of African descent and origin will be the quickest ones to pick up on the electronic world because they don't have as many filters to go through.
That's right.
He was absolutely right. The arguments I had in graduate school with some of my own classmates in the late 1970s, early 80s was all this rap hip hop stuff. Excuse me, let's go back to the talking drums and how we were outlawed. We could not have drums, so we used our feet and our percussive voices. And then young people are saying, okay, I don't play drums, but I can play 2 turntables here, plus my microphone. We have always appropriated and transformed whatever was excluded to us or used against us. That's the way we learned it back home. And we're still using the very same strategies of sending information across space. Or however we're doing it, with a cell phone, however we're doing it, we have always been the people who established the new cultural norms.
I mean, this reminds me very much of the work of Adam Banks and digital griots, right? And so Adam Banks is a rhetorician, but it works on composition, works in schools of education as well, right? And so this might be a good way of kind of connecting us. I think we're drawing close to our time in thinking about how all of these principles that we've outlined of what makes a good connection between a community and a digital project, maybe we could think about that in terms of actual traditional forms of education for K through 12. I mean, it doesn't escape us that we're having a conversation about how to reach kids with DH, but we didn't have an educator today on our panel. So I think it might be a good way for us to end by thinking about what the relationship needs to look like between Black studies, between digital humanities, and between K-12 programs, people who design curriculums, and teachers. And I wonder if we could maybe end in a way that acknowledges that as you all kind of give us some closing thoughts for today.
Can I go?
Yeah, because I want the last word always.
Because I'm gonna say this because I'm graduating and I have a little bit of freedom because it's like that moment when you're retiring. You can
Not
say
yet,
what you want.
yeah.
Excuse me.
I mean, a little bit.
Edit you out.
I think, we're in a moment with AADHum when we're having conversations around what the future of it looks like. And when you're in that space, a lot of the generative parts of that is one, reflecting on what worked or didn't work and what we could do better and what we weren't even thinking about. And I found myself during our conference saying, why don't we have junior college institutions here, and why don't we have the local K-12 teachers in that space? Because everything we were talking about was relevant in almost every space, right? So I think in a very real and tangible way for the University of Maryland, I would hope a version of AADHum looks like us training teachers here because their students are coming within 4 to 10 years, right? And particularly around DH, where we're having this structural kind of tension of needing senior scholars to run the thing so we can develop the junior, and it doesn't always make sense to me, right? Because we're in a space where we don't have a lot of senior scholars across the board who are doing this in the ways that we want it, right? So if we want the critical mass there, then we need to start with the communities first but that's not always the way the institutions work, right?
Yeah.
So then there's this weird kind of
But
feedback
that's
loop.
the way Black Studies has always
that-
worked.
Right. Exactly. So So for me, putting on wax that what I hope a future AADHum looks like, much more instead of looking at senior leadership, looks like we going to Bowie and teaching the kids how to do the thing, or we're going to the junior college because we know they'll be here in another year, and developing critical mass that way, so we can have this kind of system. Maybe, the trickle up system, if you will, needs to start with the people first, right?
Yeah, I would even add, yeah, it's so much. I would just say it's very difficult. It's easy and rewarding on some level, but very difficult to run those programs. Because I think some Black Studies, African American Studies programs do this kind of work in high schools, but I wouldn't say all of them do.
No.
And
For sure.
much of my work, as you all know, since I'm in Black communities, after a while we just start thinking about differences between Black people and Black people. And so we even know that not every Black child at this school signs up to be in a DH club.
Yeah.
And then even when they're in there, I'm very fascinated when I do open days, like you can go to this tech or do this tech. Not everybody chooses this, so it's just very fascinating too. And also there's a gender divide. Like I noticed there are more guys when we do trips to certain places who will go, and there are many reasons why the young women wouldn't want to go on those trips. So anyway, so for us on the local level, yeah, just like it's not even enough. We have to think so much about Black people, the differences between different kinds of Black people. And different economic levels of Black people, all of these kind of things that just get on and on. But I will say that I do think some thought needs to be had around how do you, how do people define themselves and how do they work, and then what is the relationship between even training people, even mentioning in grad school. It was something that wasn't mentioned. I was a classmate of Adam Banks. Actually, we both went to Penn State at the same time, and so we would talk about those things. But high school, working with high schools like I do now, was never brought up.
No.
It's just something they don't mention in a PhD program, because they're training people to be college professors. They're not training people to do the kind of stuff I do now. It would be considered below most professors, and Black and white.
That's right.
I mean, people will talk about it. Hey, we need to help the kids and do this, but they're not going to be every once a week for an hour. I'm in there with young folks who are sometimes, and it's very different. On the one hand, it's cool because I don't give them a grade, so they like me. But sometimes when they're disagreeing with me and I don't give them a grade, they're like, what can you do? So those are the kinds of things I think people could talk about that a lot, but that's the part that I think that's just, it's just not something you're prepared for in grad school. So when you even show up, how do you even start? What high school do you pick to go work with in a city? What teachers do you pick? How do you convince your university that this counts in some way?
That's a whole
So
panel.
yeah, exactly. So there you go. I think those
Welcome
kinds of
to
things.
panel 2.
Yeah.
We need to remember that Black culture was created by teenagers. They weren't enslaving my age, and y'all are on the cusp. They were taking teenagers who knew enough to choose to survive, some of them. That's always been. That was the case of the Underground Railroad, the runaways, that migration. You look at Frederick Douglass as a boy envisioning freedom by looking at boats and clouds on Chesapeake Bay. As a child, he was taking advantage of all of it and turned it around to make some money to help other people be free. It's not a question of what will they learn. It's why am I teaching you? It's why. If I'm going to get you to be able to do all of this, I want you to go out there and do something for your community. And it doesn't have to be, and that's the biggest problem we have when we're studying in the academic world, is it's either or. No, it ain't. We're dancing to 5 drums. We've got to dance to 5 drums. The old folks dance to 3, but we got to do 5 because other stuff has come in there. I'm still going to be cool enough to understand that, as Bernice Reagan says in The Songs Are Free, the song means whatever I intended to mean when I'm singing it.
That's right.
So therefore, my pedagogy, my whole vocation for teaching is who's in front of me and what are they going to teach me, because black culture has always started with the young people. If you can get them to say, Mama, how do I do this? Papa, show me how to. Or let me show you, that ain't the way you use a cell phone. Here, you're building something. Why? Because I don't want my story to get lost. I'm going to write a memoir, finish it someday, from my 13-year-old great-nephew and his cousins. Because they need to know where they came from. But he has to ask me the right questions so I can tell him the right answers. And that's what you all are doing with digital humanities. You are finding ways to give the next generation permission to do it their way and to teach us what we need to be. Because you talk about the senior scholars, that's what this panel is. You all are the senior scholars emerging. At some point, your field.
I ain't even graduated yet.
Yeah, well, I said the same thing when I was in graduate school. I'm going to have to help define my space. They can't teach me. I'm going to have to get them to say, okay, go on.
Yeah. I think it's a fantastic way to conclude in thinking about how we dance to the 5 drums at the same time and make projects that work for our tenure packet, work for our community, work for our justice-minded selves, all at the same time. And hopefully that Black Digital Humanities gets to be a space where we get to accomplish that. So thank you so much to the panel, and thank you so much to everyone for coming out. Do we have time? I think there's some questions that we can take from the audience. So thank you to the panel first for our fantastic. Please.
Yes, my name is Ben Kennard, and I work with a program similar to yours. We take high school kids and we help them, excuse me, we help them to get into school, and we help them get through school. We track them for 6 years after we get them in school. I'm from Baltimore, and I forged this relationship with a 90-year-old gentleman who went to East St. Louis and established Boys and Girls Clubs. He's actually a legend, and the way I got out of my circumstance was through sports. And what I saw in Baltimore was the cutting of the recreation budget and the elimination of those recreation centers that were the center of the community that gave the athletes the forum to be able to succeed. So there is no recreation system that allows people to ascend to a good career, if you will. But in answer and to pose a question to your question of how do you get to these young kids, my friend who formed the Boys and Girls Clubs in East St. Louis, he has a model that can be adapted to the digital humanities model and run tangentially with your program to expose kids in the inner city to the digital humanities. So that's a model, and you can reach across the aisle to bring in people like my friend who has a message for those kids.
And his name is?
His name is Archie Archavidian, and he has an incredible library that's going to be donated to the Smithsonian jazz collection, and we can talk about him later, but the model that he has created in creating these Boys and Girls Clubs, not only in East St. Louis, but in Seattle and in the district area, in the DMV, could be a model that can be used to further
That's good to
the
know.
cause.
Thank you.
That's good to know.
So my question is, how is the climate for recreation and the Boys and Girls Clubs in East St. Louis?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the, actually I'll say around sports, things go really well for folks. And I've noticed that too. I mean, man, they wouldn't like me saying it. Like, I think the young people most involved with my DH club aren't the folks who are going to be the top basketball player, football player in the city, because the football team is really good in St. Louis, and their basketball team is fairly good too. And so it's creating opportunities for other things that's sometimes a challenge, because I think there's a whole system in place around sports. So I think that's the positive. But what if you're not, the next LeBron? I think that's when it becomes like a challenge. Like, how do you create other things? I will add too, and I hate to always be the person on panel talking about the challenges, but it's just because I'm in that work, we think about it so much. But one of the big challenges we talk about is in a place like East St. Louis, because everybody will say, hey, let's do something for East St. Louis, like on these programs. There are so many programs at a given moment that you're competing constantly. So like SIUE says, I can say this even though people say what they like, they have 5 upper bound programs, like the one center. And so they have to actually get creative on how do we not overstep with the other programs. And then you just can name them. Now, that's the problem when it gets down to economics, because you can literally drive down some streets and they're nonprofit after nonprofit. And then all of their several is too small. There are many churches, right? On one hand, you'd be like, oh, wow, this is great. But it means none of these places have to contribute in a significant way to the taxes in the city. And so that's the thing that they have, like almost too many programs so where we have to be really creative, and you're always competing with each other.
And something that I noticed as an undergraduate at the university level, so many of those programs are with people who don't live there.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So they drive in, do their work, and leave,
yeah.
instead of it being kind of a bottom up,
Yeah, no question. He's absolutely right. If you go to any kind of like side program, you notice there are elder people there and very young people.
Yeah.
But they're like, like you and I would be there. We'd be the only one in our age range.
Been there, done it.
Yeah, like it's very it's fascinating in some ways, because you're like, wow, where's everybody?
Yeah,
like
including parents, right? Like parents are leaving their children here to go work somewhere else.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And then the people that are helping are living somewhere else, coming here to work, right? So there's absolutely.
Yeah, so to answer your question, they got the programs down. It's almost like, I don't know. It's something else that's needed.
There is a group, East St. Louis Arts and Cultural Coalition, that has gotten started last year, that has as its mission to start bringing people together in a collective so that they cannot be in this death spiral of competition. You also got the Jackie Joyner Kersey Center, which is amazing. You've got people almost as old as that man, who is still Coach Fenoy, the one who trained Jackie and others, is still working with these kids at the Jackie Joyner Kersey Center. How that woman raised that money and has that staffing there, and all sorts of programs of every description. So that's another place where something is emerging. And then you've got the cultural groups like Sunshine and his African art dance drum ensemble, and he's got his own cultural center, and he's been doing things for decades. That's all I'm going to say, decades. But his point is so true. You've got all of these small competitions going on, but that was one of the reasons why the Centennial Commission put itself in there, and Cultural Initiative, to stay in operation. All of us are volunteer, and the median age is probably 100 or 70 for the 3 people who are under 70. But we have no resources. But we did have enough of a voice and a public presence to generate other people thinking about, we need to be coming together, because that is one of the most critical points of, but that's the way East St. Louis was designed. to be in competition. You had the Republicans, the black Republicans and the Democrats. And I mean, those are family splits, but they were really going against each other. It has always been that way. And that's no different from plantation mentalities. Put people against each other. You got the great battle during this, during the Christmas days, back in Douglas's narrative. We've always had that, and that's the thing that we've always struggled with in civil rights and public and progress movements. So I think that what he told you is very true, but I do think that there are some places where people are thinking, bring them together under one roof.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is LaQuanda Cooper. I'm a grad student at George Mason University in Virginia.
Oh.
But I was a teacher for 15 years.
Okay.
So I'm the reverse of you, I think. And I have to agree that one of the things that kind of bugs me about TH is that here's a university,
That's right.
here's students. You've bypassed teachers.
That's
And I'm
right.
not saying it's deliberate, but there's a whole
That's right.
body, and if we want to talk about, black studies, there's a tradition of black teachers
That's right.
building the middle class.
Yep.
And I just feel like there's bureaucracies going on where you might not be able to initiate district-wide change.
Sure.
But I would love to hear you guys kind of imagine out loud
Yes.
what that looks like, one in a grad program, on a university campus that has a school of education, where are those connections at? So you're working with pre-service teachers.
Yes.
But also, not thinking just about the public school system. There are black children in Catholic schools,
Yep.
in independent schools, in charter schools, as well as neighborhood public schools. So I would just love to hear you guys kind of think out loud about what that future might look like with doing DH in a school space with teachers, as opposed to kind of excluding them.
Yeah.
Because I think it would actually also help with learning in the actual classroom, as opposed to it being an auxiliary
Absolutely.
activity or an extracurricular activity.
Fantastic question.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I'm going to let the Catholic priest over there answer the Catholic portion of this. But I do think, so I absolutely 100% agree with you, the role of teachers. And in fact, I don't think, as we think about college and universities producing DH or encouraging, cultivating DH out in the community, I don't think us being there in long-term ways is sustainable. So really a perfect kind of model for me is teaching teachers how to teach the thing, right? Because I don't know the nuance of, even locally, I don't know the nuance of Bowie, but the teacher does. I can give you the skill set and you already know the thing, you go and replicate that how you see fit. I think is the exact model for what I would hope of the future of Black DH looks like. So we're in harmony that way. I do think also, not just thinking about private institutions, but the other sites where education has happened historically for Black communities. So I did more homework in libraries because of library programs than I ever did at school. School was easy. The library stuff was the fun things I did when I didn't play sports was at the library. There's and it's interesting how DH has, in a lot of ways, developed in the library, the university library system, that I think that we could better exploit the relationship university libraries have with local library systems, the local community, right? The local library systems that way. And then again, this kind of thing around extracurricular, right? So I actually, one of my first computer training courses happened at a local Y, right? Because we went to play ball, but there was always that 1 hour before the gym opened, right? So there was always these ways that they would scheme us into doing other things, and I'm actually a very big proponent of using scheming as a teaching tool. So scheming.
Really?
Oh yeah, that's any of my students know I will scheme them into the work, and that's for sure. But no, I think the future of Black DH must include K-12 teachers. If it doesn't, I struggle to see a more efficient way of producing the critical mass at the higher education level that so many of our university administrators want. I just don't see any other way of doing it that makes sense. So yeah.
We just kind of have to talk about, I'm sorry, moderator's privilege.
Yeah.
I mean, talking about ourselves at the University of Maryland being situated in Prince George's County and the history of terrible relationships, right, that this university has with local schools, with local folks and communities, and why it is that the enrollment rate of black folks at the University of Maryland is going down instead of up in a county that is predominantly black and middle class and should be sending their kids to the University of Maryland. And so a lot of the work on the part of the university is on rectifying relationships. And part of that has to be through trust that's built with educators and administrators if we want to have those kind of relationships with schools. We can't jump into schools and create aftercare programs and after-school programs to teach kids when our relationship is so damaged with the community that we're hoping to reach. And so I think that part of that is a respect for the community, but a respect for what teachers do as well. So I'm partnered with an educator who I talked to, we should, people should go into schools and teach kids. You don't know how to teach kids, right? I don't know how to teach kids.
Right,
things.
exactly.
I am not trained in that. This is a skill set. This is what people go to and spend their lives mastering, the art and skill of doing. And so respecting educators and people who design curriculums is something that universities have to do a much better job of. And that DH has to do a good job of if we want to start partnering with students early enough to get them interested in what we're doing at the undergraduate and graduate level. Yeah. It's too late by grad school sometimes to say, hey, here's this thing called DH. Well, I got to finish my dissertation, right? All right, then you get into the tenure. Well, I got to get my tenure now, right? And so if we start talking to kids about digital humanities with teachers who actually know how to talk to kids about curriculum and how to weave things into classrooms, right? Then we might have a sense of how to not only cultivate some, cohort of faculty who are DHers, but actually put into practice, into regular, ordinary curriculum, the humanities and the digital, right? In ways that are palatable for schools who really want their students to learn technology, but I think are misguided in that only being STEM education, right? So how do we get teachers on board who I think would be more than on board to say, I don't necessarily think that my students need to learn everything there is to know about coding, but I sure would like them to learn about history. And if you can make learning about history work in ways that tap into skill sets they already have and tap into memory that they already have using the digital, there's a natural kind of connection there, but there has to be a willingness on the part of the university to take some accountability for the damaged relationships that we've created.
Are you going to talk about your Douglas project?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, actually, so I got a NEH to do a Douglas, Frederick Douglass, Maryland guy. To do on Frederick Douglass, a summer institute, but it's for school teachers.
Awesome.
But so that's cool. So we'll have 25 school teachers. We'll meet with a week and do sessions on Douglas. But what I've been fascinated most and taking most of my time is the kind of recruiting I had to do for this. So I pushed myself to email 1,000 principals in every state in the country, all states in the country, just to encourage them to ask their teachers, and so following up like that. But it occurred to me this is the first time I had even had the interest and incentive to even reach out to that many teachers at one time, like literally every state. But it also caused me to start paying attention to what are different school systems looking like, what might they look around Douglas, interest in Douglas. So I think one of the things I'm learning too is that teachers like you said you taught for 15 years, I already know one of the messages that I have to send to the professors who will be teaching is to let them know that more of the teachers have more experience teaching than they do. Like on average,
and are trained to teach.
Yeah.
As we are not.
We're not trained.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So on average, I think the majority of the teachers who applied for this institute have 20 or more years teaching.
Yeah.
Whereas the professors who are going to be presenting they're in around 10, only had 10, and it's not the same kind of thing.
At all.
Yeah, so I think that's why you have a big distance though between DH teachers and even students, because often DH is like people who are in DH talking to each other.
Yeah.
And professors in general just don't have to be as practical.
That's right.
On things they can just, you probably noticed that in your shift.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the getting that. But and to be fair though, I will say that sometimes that kind of the things you gain in grad school, for me, before DH, I was into something called Afrofuturism. One of my big mentors, Alondra Nelson, who created this kind of space to talk about it. And so I remember being in grad school, and that's what we would do, is like they had this listserv, and you would just talk about like technology and interactions between black folks. Now Afrofuturism has become a little different now, which is fine, but I was glad to have gone into it like that. So it was some value for me to be theorizing about what I thought it was and imagining things, and then, because I wouldn't be in the space I am now. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Just figuring out that distance and recognizing it and inserting incentives to make contact. Because I'm so glad about this NEH grant, because I didn't have any other reason to contact so many teachers until now. So.
I do want to be respectful of the time of folks in the space. I think that our panel will likely be around and here for conversation afterwards, but I do also want to be respectful of the tech staff and thank them very much for their work in setting up microphones and cameras and getting this recorded for us. So let's thank them as well. And thank you all for being here. We're going to wrap now and let folks continue the conversation after we get out of here.